Greed and curiosity are dangerous, especially when mixed with black magic. Deep in the woods, there is a cabin surrounded in darkness and whispers of an ancient ritual gone wrong. Three friends, lured by their own ambition, stepped inside and unleashed something they could never escape. This is their story. Welcome, mortals, to the forbidden frequency, where the shadows whisper and the stories bite. I am your host, Azrath, and tonight we dive into the darkness. There is a place upstate, far from the highways, where the trees grow too close together and the air feels heavy, like the forest is watching you. The cabin at the heart of those woods has been abandoned for decades, though no one in the nearby town will say why. The only detail they will give, if you push them, is a warning. Don't go there at night. Don't even think about it. Decades ago, the cabin was owned by a man named Arthur Crane, a known recluse and a practitioner of the occult. People said he dabbled in rituals he shouldn't have, things that didn't just summon spirits, but bound them. Arthur wasn't just experimenting, he was hunting for something ancient and powerful. He wanted a servant from the other side, something that would give him control over life, death, and everything in between. But the rituals required sacrifice. Animals at first, then vagrants who no one would miss. But the final ritual, they say, needed something purer, a soul taken unwillingly. One night, the townsfolk heard screams echoing from the forest, louder than they had ever heard before. The sound twisted, becoming inhuman, like a mix of crying, howling, and laughing. A few brave men ventured into the woods to find Arthur and put an end to whatever he was doing. But when they reached the cabin, they found the door open and the air reeking of iron and rot. Inside, there were no signs of Arthur, but there was a figure standing in the middle of the room, a shadow shaped like a man, but with no features. It looked toward the men, and before they could scream, the lanterns blew out. The next morning, their bodies were found scattered across the forest, and their faces were frozen in terror, and their mouths were sewn shut with black thread. Arthur was never seen again. After that incident, many years passed by. 2 years later, three friends, Jack, Rachel, and Mike, decided to spend a weekend camping in those woods. They didn't believe the stories, and they needed a break from the city. The first night was quiet, and the forest was incessantly still. But on the second night, Mike suggested they should check out the cabin. It's just an old shack, he said. What's the worst that could happen? When they arrived, the cabin looked just as the legends described. Its wooden walls blackened as though they were burned, with symbols scratched onto the doorframe. Inside, the air was ice cold, though there was no wind outside. Dust coated every surface, and the only light that came inside was from their flashlights. Jack found a book on the floor, its cover made of leather so old it felt brittle. When he opened it, The writings inside was jagged and crude, as though written in a frenzy. Rachel read one line aloud, her voice trembling. One soul to bind the eternal servant. The air shifted. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, and a sound like whispering began to fill the cabin, though none of them could make out the words. Rachel wanted to leave, but Mike insisted on exploring further. They found a trapdoor leading to a cellar, and despite her protests, Mike opened it. The stench that poured out was overwhelming, rotten meat and something sour. As they climbed down, they found the cellar, lined with shelves of jars, each one filled with black liquid. Floating inside were things they couldn't identify, things with too many eyes or limbs that bent the wrong way. In the center of the room was a circle of ruins carved into the floor, stained dark with old blood. And then they heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from above. Jack and Rachel froze, but Mike whispered, "It's just the wind." Then something replied from above,
The wind doesn't work.
They scrambled up the ladder, only to find the cabin dark and pitch black, though the sun hadn't yet set. Their flashlights wouldn't turn on, and the steps were circling the room. Then came a voice, low, gravely, and inhuman. "Who called me back?" The shadows gathered in a corner, swirling until they formed the shape of a man, tall, skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to draw the light out of the room. Its mouth split into a smile that stretched too far, revealing rows of blackened teeth. Rachel screamed and ran for the door, but it slammed shut. The creature laughed, its voice echoing from every corner of the cabin. "You called me, you stay." As the words echoed through the cabin, the room fell into an unnatural silence. Even their breathing seemed muted. The air grew colder and the darkness felt alive, pressing in on them from every side. Jack turned to Rachel and Mike, his face pale. "Don't move, don't speak," he said, though his voice barely came out. But the shadows had other plans. A low groaning noise came from the walls, like wood bending under immense pressure. The floor beneath their feet started to crack and buckle. Mike stumbled back, but his feet sank into the floor. It wasn't wood anymore. It was soft and dumb, like flesh. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the cabin itself. Her voice cut off, as though it had been yanked away. Her flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of light, she saw something, someone, standing just inches behind Mike. It wasn't the shadowy figure they had seen earlier. It was a woman, or what was left of her. Her skin was grey and stretched tight over her bones, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Her eyes were hollow pits, and her fingers were blackened, like they had been burned. Rachel froze, unable to speak. Then the woman moved. The figure reached out and touched Mike's shoulder. He didn't scream, he didn't even flinch. He just stopped moving, his body rigid as though he turned into a stone. His head snapped in towards Rachel and Jack, but his eyes were wrong. Black, endless voids that seemed to pull them in. Jack tried to shield Rachel, but one of the tendrils of black smoke wrapped around her wrist, burning her skin. He let out a choked cry as it pulled him toward the corner of the room. Rachel stumbled back, her eyes darting around for an escape, but there was none. The shadows were alive, shifting and crawling, their shapes forming faces, dozens of faces, all watching her. Run, Jack shouted, but before she could move, the shadows surged forward, engulfing them both. The cabin stood silent once more. The air inside was still. The symbols on the walls were now dark. Jack, Rachel, and Mike were gone, swallowed by whatever dark force they had awakened. The only sign they had ever been there was a signal, blackened handprint on the door, burned onto the wood. They say the cabin is still there, hidden deep in the woods. Some nights, if you stand outside and listen closely, you can hear whispers coming from inside. Some say they are the voices of Jack, Rachel, and Mike, trapped forever in the shadows. Others believe they have become part of the darkness itself, waiting for someone else to come calling. And if you are foolish enough to enter, don't expect to leave, because once the cabin has you, it doesn't let go. Wanna hear more stories like this? Well, tune in next time if you dare. But remember, I'll be always listening. Will you?